The general had a bourbon in one hand and a folded speech in his breast pocket, and the moment he saw the coin hanging at my collarbone, he forgot about both of them. He set the glass down on a passing waiter's tray without looking, the way you'd set down something you suddenly couldn't feel anymore. Then he crossed the ballroom toward me, and people kept trying to shake his hand, and he walked through them like they were weather. He didn't say, "Excuse me." He didn't ask who I was. He reached out and turned a little brass disc over with 2 fingers, tilting it so the chandelier light caught the worn engraving, and every bit of colour left his face. "Where did you get this?" he said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat and low, the way men talk when they're afraid of their own voice. "It was my grandfather's," I said. He let go of the coin and took a half step back, and for a second I thought the man was going to fall. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Somewhere that isn't here." And that was the moment I understood that the quiet old man my family had let slip out of the world without so much as a phone call had been someone none of us ever bothered to know. Let me back up. My grandfather lived alone in a narrow house at the dead end of a road called Prout Lane, just outside Marrow Falls, Pennsylvania. It's the kind of town you'd miss if you sneezed driving through it. One traffic light that blinks yellow after 9. A diner, a hardware store, a Methodist church, a Dollar General that opened when I was in high school and felt to everybody there like progress. He'd lived in that house for 50 years. Same green shutters, same sagging porch, same little workshop out back that smelled like motor oil and cold metal, and the cherry tobacco he wasn't supposed to be smoking. He was a machinist. That's what he always said, and it was true as far as it went. He'd worked at a tool and die shop 2 towns over until he was almost 70, and even after he retired, people still brought him things to fix: a stuck carburetor, a busted mower, a music box that had belonged to somebody's dead wife. He could fix anything. He'd hold a broken thing in his big square hands and turn it over and over, patient, like the thing would eventually tell him what was wrong with it. I used to sit on a stool in that workshop and watch him for hours. To my parents, he was a chore, an item on a list. My father, his own son, talked about him the way you talk about a leaky gutter you keep meaning to deal with. "He's stubborn," my dad would say. "He won't move. He won't take help. He likes living in that drafty box." My mother had her own version. "Your grandfather never went anywhere, never did anything. He could have made something of himself with those hands, and he just stayed out there fixing lawnmowers." I heard that sentence, or one just like it, at probably 20 Thanksgivings. They almost never visited. Marrow Falls was 3.5 hours from where we grew up outside Columbus, and somehow those 3.5 hours were always too far. Christmas would come and go. His birthday would come and go. I'd call him and he'd sound surprised every single time, like he'd genuinely lost track of who still had his number. "You don't need to fuss over me, kiddo," he'd say. "I know you've got your own life." I told myself I was busy. I told myself a lot of things back then. When he got sick, nobody scrambled. My mother said he'd been slowing down for years, like that explained it. My father said the doctors would handle it. My brother didn't even answer the group text. He just left it sitting there with the little "delivered" under it, which somehow felt worse than no at all. I was grading papers at my kitchen table in Columbus when his neighbor, Dot Brenner, called me from her landline because she didn't trust cell phones. "Honey, your granddad collapsed in the yard," she said. "Ambulance took him to the county hospital. I've been calling the family and nobody's picking up. You're the only one who answered. I taught high school history and I had a sub lined up by 6 the next morning and was on the turnpike before 7. 3.5 hours of grey highway and a tightness in my chest. I couldn't loosen no matter how I breathed. By the time I got there, he looked small. That's the thing that gutted me. Those hands that could fix anything were lying open and useless on a white blanket. And there were tubes and a monitor that beeped in a rhythm I couldn't stop counting. He smiled when he saw me. Same crooked smile he'd had my whole life. You drove all this way, he said. Of course I did, Grandpa. He patted the rail of the bed like he wanted to pat my hand and couldn't reach. Don't be hard on your dad, he said. Some folks only know how to love the parts of a person they can see. It isn't their fault, exactly. Nobody ever taught them to look harder. I didn't understand what he meant. I do now. He died 2 nights later, in his sleep, while a night nurse was 3 rooms down. No deathbed speech, no last secret whispered into my ear. He just went the way he'd lived, without making a fuss about it. I stayed in that room a long time after, until they needed it, and I held his hand even though it had already gone cool, because I couldn't figure out how to let go of a man my family had already filed away years ago. The funeral was 9 people, I counted. The pastor, me, Doc Brenner, the man who ran the hardware store, 2 old fellows from the American Legion post who I'd never met, a woman in a navy coat who stood at the very back and left during the last hymn before I could thank her, and the funeral director and his assistant, who I'm not sure count. My parents sent a spray of white carnations with a card that said, "In loving memory." My brother texted, "So sorry, couldn't get off work." I stood at the graveside in a wind that cut right through my good coat and thought about every birthday he'd spent alone, every 3-minute phone call, every time somebody changed the subject when his name came up. I didn't cry exactly, I just felt heavy, like something had moved into my chest and started unpacking. My parents had questions, and the questions were all about logistics. How fast could the house sell? Whether the truck was worth anything? Whether there was a life insurance policy nobody knew about. No point letting it sit there rotting, my mother said, and I remember holding the phone away from my face so she wouldn't hear what I was breathing like. I drove back out the next weekend to clear the place out, because somebody had to, and it sure wasn't going to be them. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect from an old man who'd lived alone for decades. Flannel shirts worn soft as tissue, a coffee can full of nails sorted by size, westerns with cracked spines, 3 of them with the same title because he kept forgetting he'd read them, a calendar from the feed store still turned to the wrong month, in the freezer 11 identical containers of the chili he made every fall. I sat on his kitchen floor and cried over the chili, which is a sentence I never expected to say. It was in the back of his bedroom closet, under a stack of moving blankets, that I found the footlocker. Olive drab, dented with a stenciled number half worn off the side. It wasn't locked. Inside, there wasn't much. A folded triangle of fabric I didn't recognize at first and then did. A folded American flag, the kind they hand to widows. Except no one had ever handed it to anyone. It was just sitting there. A few black and white photos of young men in flight suits with their arms slung around each other, squinting into some sun a long way from Pennsylvania. A maroon beret, flattened with age. A sheet of paper, official-looking, with most of it blacked out in thick censor's lines, so that what was left read like a poem with all the important words torn out. And a small velvet pouch. Inside the pouch was the coin, brass, about the size of a silver dollar, worn smooth around the edge from being carried in a pocket for 50 years. On one side, an emblem I didn't recognize, a parachute, a pair of wings, a circle of stars. On the other, a few words stamped in a half circle, almost rubbed away, that others may live. And below that, a string of numbers I took for a date and didn't. I'd seen that coin my whole life. He kept it in his right front pocket always, and he'd worry it with his thumb when he was thinking, the way some men work a worry stone. Once, when I was maybe 10, I asked him what it was. He closed his hand around it and said, "Just an old lucky penny, kiddo. Reminds me where I've been." Then he asked if I wanted a root beer, and that was that. I put the coin in my own pocket the way he used to, and I drove home with it, and somewhere on the turnpike I decided I'd have a jeweler put a small loop on it so I could wear it on a chain. I told myself it was because I missed him. I think now it was because some part of me already knew it meant something, and I wanted to keep it close until the rest of me caught up. I asked my parents about it, of course. My mother laughed. Actually laughed. Your grandfather had a million pieces of junk like that, she said. He probably won it pitching pennies at the VFW. When I described the flag, the beret, the blacked-out paper, she went quiet for just a second longer than she should have. And then she said, he was in the service for a couple years when he was young. Everybody was, back then. It wasn't a big thing. My father was worse. Don't go building him into something he wasn't, he said. I lived with the man. He fixed engines and he kept to himself and he wasn't easy to love and now he's gone. Let him be. There was an edge under it. Defensiveness, maybe. The voice of a man who's afraid he's about to find out he was wrong about something he can no longer apologize for. So I let it go. For about a month. Then my friend who teaches across the hall, her husband's a pilot, retired Air Force, talked me into being her +1 at a black tie fundraiser downtown for an aviation heritage museum. $500 a plate, which her husband's old unit was covering. Full of men with silver hair and rows of little ribbons, and the kind of straight backs you can't fake. I almost didn't go. I'm a 31-year-old high school teacher. I do not belong at a $500 dinner. But she insisted, and I had a black dress that almost fit, and I wore my grandfather's coin because by then I wore it everywhere, which is how I ended up in that ballroom, with a retired 3-star general's hand frozen an inch from my collarbone, watching the blood drain out of a man who had spent his life being the one who stayed calm. He took me out a side door onto a stone terrace, away from the noise. His hands weren't steady. He kept starting sentences and stopping them. Finally, he said, "Tell me his name." I told him. "Earl Dempsey." He shut his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. And he was not a man who let that happen often, you could tell. "Earl," he said, the way you'd say a word in a language you hadn't spoken in 50 years. "Earl Dempsey." He sat down hard on the stone bench. "I have been to 100 of these dinners," he said. "I gave money to build a wall with names on it, and the man who carried me out is buried in a county plot in Pennsylvania, and I never knew, because I never knew his real name. I only ever knew the call sign. He asked me for my number and my grandfather's town, and he wrote them on the back of a card with a shaking hand, and then he stood, smoothed his jacket, and went back inside to give his speech, because that's the kind of man he was. But I saw him at the podium 20 minutes later, and his voice broke once on a word that had nothing to do with anything, and I think I was the only one who knew why. His name was General Roy Holloway, and 3 days later I sat across a desk from him at a small office out by the regional airport, a flag in the corner and a glass of water already poured for me, and he told me who my grandfather was. "Your grandfather was a para-escue man," he said. "A PJ. You ever hear that term?" I shook my head. Air Force, the men they sent in to get other men out. Downed pilots, wounded crews, people stranded in places we weren't officially supposed to be. It's the hardest training in the military and the least famous job in it by design. Their motto's on that coin you're wearing, that others may live. That's the whole of it. That's the entire job, summed up in 3 words. I sat there. My grandfather fixed lawnmowers. A lot of what those teams did during those years stayed classified for decades, Holloway went on. Some of it still is. They went into places the government couldn't admit we were operating in, which means the men who went there couldn't be written up, couldn't be decorated where anybody could see, couldn't tell their families a thing. They came home and they took jobs at gas stations and tool shops and post offices, and they kept their mouths shut for the rest of their lives. That was the deal. You take the secret to the grave so that everybody else stays safe. "And you knew him," I said. "He pulled me out of a valley in 1968, Holloway said. "I was 23 years old, and I'd put my aircraft into the side of a mountain in country we were not supposed to be over. And I had a broken leg and the worst day of my life. And a helicopter came in under fire it had no business surviving. and a man came down a cable. And that man put his own body between me and everything that was trying to kill me, and he got me up and out, and he handed me that coin in the back of the helicopter, and he said, "You're not done yet, kid." Holloway's jaw worked. I have a wife. I have 4 children. I have 11 grandchildren. Every single one of them exists because Earl Dempsey came down a cable on the worst day of my life. And I never knew his name, and I never got to say thank you, and now I never will. I had to look at the floor for a minute. "Why didn't he ever say anything?" I said finally. "Not to me. Not to anybody. He let his own son think he never did a single thing that mattered." Holloway was quiet for a while. "Because that's the price of the work," he said. "You don't get the parade. You don't get the thank you. You get a quiet house at the end of a quiet road and the knowledge that you did the thing, whether anyone knows it or not. Most people can't carry that. Most people need to be seen. The ones who can carry it without being seen. Those are the strongest people I ever met in my life. And your grandfather was the strongest of all of them." I drove home that night, and I don't remember a mile of it. When I got back to my apartment, I dumped the whole footlocker out on my living room floor and went through it inch by inch. And this time, tucked inside the folded flag where I'd missed it, there was an envelope. My name was on it in his handwriting. That careful, blocky print he used because he said cursive was for showing off. "Kiddo," it said, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you were the one who cared enough to go through an old man's junk, which tells me I was right about you all along. There's a lot about my life I could never tell anybody, and I won't pretend that was easy, especially when your dad looked at me like I'd wasted myself. There were nights I wanted to set him straight so bad I could taste it. But I made a promise a long time ago, and a promise you only keep when it's convenient isn't worth the breath it took to make it. So I kept it. I want you to know I don't regret what I did. The only thing I ever regretted was what the keeping of it cost the people I loved, the time it put between us, the distance I let them believe in. If anybody ever asks you about the coin, you tell them the truth. Tell them it was mine, and tell them you were the one I trusted with it. That's all the recognition I ever wanted. Take care of your dad. He's not as hard as he acts. Grandpa. I read it 3 times and then I sat on my floor and cried, the way you cry when you're alone and there's no one to perform it for. The next weekend I went back to Morrow Falls, not to the house. Strangers were already in it. I could see their wind chimes on his porch. But to the town. I went to the diner and the hardware store and the church and the little library above the fire hall. And I started asking people about my grandfather, and a picture started coming together that I'd never been shown. The woman at the church told me he dropped an envelope of cash in the box every December for as long as she'd been there, never signed, but she knew his handwriting from the alterations he'd done on the choir robes for free. The hardware store man told me Grandpa had quietly paid the heating bill for a young family 2 winters running when the husband got laid off from the quarry, and made them swear not to say where it came from. Dot Brenner told me he'd sat with her husband every single afternoon for the last 6 weeks of the man's life, just sat there and talked about nothing because Dot couldn't bear to watch and somebody had to. The librarian, a sharp older woman named Mrs. Okafor, told me he'd taught half the kids in town to read engine manuals and tie knots and fix their own bikes, and that there were grown men in that county who'd tell you Earl Dempsey was the closest thing to a father they'd had. He never said much about himself, she told me, but he listened like a man who'd seen things. You could tell. There's a kind of quiet that's just empty, and there's a kind that's full all the way up. His was the full kind. I drove home with the truth of him settling into me, and I knew what I had to do, and I dreaded it. I called a family dinner, got my parents and my brother in one room, which doesn't happen, and I put the letter and the coin and a copy of the partly unredacted citation Holloway's office had managed to get released on the table between us. "I need you to read this," I said. My father picked up the letter. I watched his face while he read it. I watched the exact moment it stopped being an inconvenience and became something he didn't have a word for. He read it twice. Then he set it down very carefully, like it might break, and he said, in a voice I'd never heard him use, "All these years I thought he had nothing to show me." "He had everything to show you," I said. "You just decided who he was before he ever got a chance." My mother had the citation in her hands, and her hands were shaking. "He never told us," she whispered. "Because you never wanted to hear it," I said. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. I was just tired and sad and done pretending. Every time I said, "Let's drive out and see him," somebody had a reason we couldn't. Every time he called, we kept it to 3 minutes. We let a man like that die in a county hospital with a stranger 3 rooms away, and we called it him being stubborn so we wouldn't have to call it us not showing up. The room got very quiet. My brother, who had not said a word, who had not so much as taken his coat off, finally spoke. He asked me to help him put a new roof on the workshop last spring. He said, "I told him I'd come out in a couple weeks. I never went." He put his head in his hands. "I never went." My father reached across the table and put his hand over the coin, just rested it there, and he didn't say anything for a long time. When he did, his voice came out wrecked. "I spent my whole life judging people by what they put on display," he said. "And I missed the best man I ever knew, and he was sitting right there the whole time." Nobody argued with him. Nobody made it better. We just sat with it, which was the only honest thing left to do. A few weeks later, General Holloway arranged a small ceremony. Not a big public thing. Grandpa would have hated that. And besides, half of what he'd done still couldn't be spoken about out loud. Just a gathering at the cemetery in Marrow Falls. Holloway came in a plain dark suit with no ribbons, because he said it wasn't about him. 2 other old men came too. Men who walked with the same straight backs. Men who didn't introduce themselves with rank. And I understood without being told that they were the last of my grandfather's team. The ones still above ground. The woman in the navy coat from the funeral came again, and this time she didn't leave early, and it turned out she was the widow of a man Grandpa had carried out of some place he could never name, and she'd been quietly looking out for him for 40 years, the way that kind of debt makes you do. There were no speeches about heroism. There was a flag, folded right this time, and one of the old men handed it to my father, and my father held it like it was the heaviest thing he'd ever lifted. My brother had driven out the day before and re-roofed the workshop on the house that wasn't ours anymore, because the new owners said yes when he asked, and because he just needed to do it. My mother brought tomatoes from the garden she'd planted in her own backyard that spring, the first thing I'd ever seen her grow, and laid them on the stone, which made no sense, and all the sense in the world. I stayed after everyone left. I sat down in the grass next to the headstone the way I used to sit on the stool in his workshop, and I took the coin off my neck and held it in my palm and worried it with my thumb the way he always did. "I found your letter," I said out loud to nobody to him, "and you were right. I was the one who looked." The wind moved through the maples and a few early leaves came down, and that was the only answer I got. And somehow it was enough. Holloway sent me one more letter before his office closed for good. Just a few lines. "Your grandfather once told me, in the back of that helicopter, that the bravest thing a man can do is the right thing when there's nobody around to clap for it. I have thought about that sentence every day for 57 years. I hope his family has come to understand the kind of man they had. We have, not all at once and not perfectly. My father drives out to Marrow Falls now a couple times a year and puts flowers on the grave and stops at the library to leave books in Earl Dempsey's name. He and I talk about Grandpa the way we never could when he was alive, not with that scab of guilt over everything, though that's there too, but with something close to wonder. My brother kept the maroon beret. He doesn't say why. He doesn't have to. My mother asked me once if I still wear the coin every day. And I told her I do. And she asked if it makes me sad. And I thought about it for a while. "No," I said. "It reminds me to pay attention." She nodded. Slow. I wish I'd started paying attention a lot sooner, she said. And I didn't tell her it was too late because it isn't. Not really, not as long as you're still here to do better. I still teach high school history. I still spend my days in front of 30 kids who'd rather be on their phones, trying to make them care about people who are dead and gone. But I teach it differently now. I tell them that for every name carved into a monument, there are 100 you'll never hear. Men and women who did the quiet, unglamorous, world-holding work and went home and never said a word about it. I tell them the loudest people in the room are almost never the ones doing the heaviest lifting. I tell them about a man who could fix anything, who carried a brass coin in his pocket for 50 years, who came down a cable into the worst day of a stranger's life and then went home to grow tomatoes and keep his promise. I don't use his name in class. Some of it still isn't mine to tell. But I look out at those kids and I think about all the people sitting at the edges of their own lives right now. The grandfather at the end of a gravel road, the quiet aunt who never married, the neighbor who shovels everybody's walk before sunup and never asks for so much as a thank you. And I want to grab every one of my students by the shoulders and say, don't wait. Don't tell yourself you'll drive out next month. Don't decide who somebody is before you've done the work of finding out. Go now, ask the question. Sit on the stool and watch their hands and listen to the kind of quiet they carry, because there's a kind that's empty and a kind that's full all the way up, and by the time you learn to tell the difference, the ones with the fullest hearts are so often already gone, having never once asked to be seen. Mine was, and I almost missed him, and the only thing I can do about that now is make sure I never miss anyone like him again. For a long time after, I kept coming back to one line my grandfather wrote, that a promise you only keep when it's convenient isn't worth the breath it took to make it. Earl Dempsey kept his for 50 years in a drafty house at the end of Pruitt Lane, while his own son decided he was a man who had wasted his life. And the hardest truth I had to sit with is that none of what happened to him was an accident. We treated him like he was small, so he grew smaller in our eyes. And then we used that smallness as the excuse not to drive the 3.5 hours, not to pick up on the second ring, not to show up while there was still someone there to show up for. Cause and effect. We built the distance ourselves, one skipped visit at a time, and then we called the distance his fault. What undid me was realizing the same man my father wrote off had spent his whole life choosing to do the right thing when there was nobody around to clap for it. That's the part I've come to believe matters most. Anybody can be decent with an audience. It takes a different kind of backbone to come down a cable into a stranger's worst day, hand him a coin, and then go home and grow tomatoes and never say a word. Not for credit, not for thanks, just because it was right. I used to think character was something you performed. He taught me after he was already gone that the real kind is mostly what you do in the rooms nobody is watching. He taught me something about seeing, too. I'd looked at that man my entire life and only ever caught the surface. The flannel, the oil under his nails, the 3-minute phone calls. Mrs. Okafor said it best in that little library. There's a quiet that's empty and a quiet that's full all the way up. And the smart thing, the wise thing, is learning to tell them apart before it's too late. I missed it for 31 years. General Holloway, who owed him his life and never knew his name, missed it too. We were all so sure we already understood him that we never bothered to actually look. And then there's the plain endurance of it. The strength to carry a thing alone, to let people you love think less of you, and to never set the record straight because you gave your word. I don't know yet if I have that in me. I'd like to think I'm building it. So that's what I'm after now, to do right when no one's watching, to look past the surface of the quiet ones before they're gone, and to carry the heavy things without needing applause for it. Dot Brenner sat with a dying man because somebody had to. My grandfather came down that cable. The least I can do is keep paying attention.